So for those of you who don't know me yet, my name's Donna, and I'm responsible for EDLAB's activities for teaching staff like this one. And today I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker, and she's coming all the way from Dubai today. And we have Dr. Amanda Nimon-Peters with us. And Dr. Nimon-Peters has a PhD in behavioral sciences from Cambridge University. And she's also worked for a long time in corporate industry in a variety of different roles, I believe. And at the moment, she's a business school professor and a research fellow at Hult International Business School, as well as an independent consultant. And this morning, Amanda's going to be talking to us about the role of learner happiness in the learning process. And I think we can all agree that this is a topic that's highly relevant during this current global health crisis that's rather stressful for everyone, not just the students, but for staff as well. So with that short introduction, I'd like to pass over to Amanda.
Hello, everyone. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Good morning for you in the Netherlands. Welcome to the session. As you know, I'll be talking about the role of emotions and happiness in student learning, but most specifically, what I want all of us to be able to focus on is not just learning some new information, but really identifying what does this mean for you and what can you take from your investment of time in the next 60, 75 minutes in order to improve your own expertise and your own evaluation scores and your own sense of achievement for the teaching that you're doing. First up, though, I'd like to start by wishing you a happy new year from me here in Dubai to you in the Netherlands. And I'll just ask Donna a thumbs up. You can see the next slide. Is that correct? Good, perfect, just checking that works. So this is a kangaroo statue that sat in our front yard for quite a long time until earlier, well, now around about 11 months ago, when we started dressing it up as a way to sort of bring some kind of cheer to the neighborhood. And so this kangaroo, which is currently in a Happy New Year outfit, has also appeared over the course of the last 9 months in a Christmas outfit. And we had a theme for Valentine's Day also. And every month or so, we try to put something positive out there into the community. Now, of course, you don't get any kind of feedback, and we didn't know if this was actually having any effect until quite recently we discovered that the Arabian Ranchers community where we live, Facebook page actually has an account for this kangaroo. It's not run by us or any member of my household. And indeed, there's a gentleman I've never heard of who posts on behalf of my kangaroo to the rest of the community, comments on the latest outfit, and puts words into Skippy's mouth. So this was a really nice discovery. So I wanted to wish a Happy New Year to you from me in Dubai to the Netherlands. But actually, once upon a time, I was myself in the Netherlands, and this is back, gosh, it's quite a few years back now. I used to live in The Hague. I worked in Rotterdam, and I'm sure that me and my friends are not the first people ever to pretend to be windmills in a field full of tulips, but gosh, did we think we were funny at the time. So this is just one of my memories of living in the Netherlands. Way back, even before living in the Netherlands, I was actually a scientist working in the Antarctic. So my background is in science, in behavioral science. My doctoral research was around determining the extent to which breeding Antarctic penguins are disturbed, influenced, stressed by being visited by tourists in the Antarctic. And so here's a couple of pictures from back in those days, in the very late 20th century. On the top left-hand corner there, that is me digging our huts out of the ice, because we left these garden huts there over the winter. We were only there in the summer when the animals were around. You can see one of our huts open. You can see in the background the tents that we used to sleep in. On the bottom left-hand side there, that's a picture of our tent, of our camp, with some penguins around. And the bottom right-hand side, that is indeed the Gen 2 penguin species, which is the species that I did my PhD on. So by background and by training, I am a behavioral scientist, and first at the University of Adelaide If you're trying to work out what the accent is, there's Australian in there. And then at the University of Cambridge. And within behavioral science, my interest has always been, how can we take very well-established principles that we know have been shown to be true over and again in different situations and apply them to our everyday practices to improve the things that we're doing. And after I did a postdoc at Cambridge, and then I actually moved to Brussels, to the Western European headquarters of Procter & Gamble, ended up working for 10 years in industry. And my role at that time, when working in Brussels, in Rotterdam, in London, and then eventually in Dubai, was to use things that we know to be true about human behavior, about cognitive and social psychology, how people process information, how they respond to stimuli, in order to improve everyday business practices. And as a result, today I am a professor, a research fellow, and also working as an independent consultant. But my kind of day job, if you like, is at Hult International Business School, where I teach data analysis and I teach leadership development to 3 different levels of students: the master's degree students, who are typically in their early 20s, the MBA students, who tend to be more sort of 7 to 10 years into their career, and the executive MBA students, who tend to be more in their late 30s, 40s, sometimes even 50s, who are looking to consolidate their knowledge or to grow their technical expertise into becoming general managers. But there are a lot of things actually that we share, besides the fact that we have both lived in the Netherlands. Donna has told me quite a bit about the very unique and well thought through teaching methods that you use to concentrate on developing your student capability. And I think that both the school that I work in and the university that you work in care an awful lot about the outcome for their students and about really using new approaches and continually developing expertise in the area of producing great outcome for their students. In speaking with Donna, I've learned that the professors teaching at Maastricht University in many respects really care about being good teachers. And that's certainly something that here at Hult we are concerned about also for a very long time. In fact, before we started focusing about 5-6 years ago on our research strategy, prior to that, the school was all about producing really great outcomes for students. And a lot of that legacy is still with us today. So our professors are continually focused on not just teaching, but how they can be really good at teaching. And when you make being really good at teaching your goal, it helps to inspire you to continually be looking for new practices. And I believe that by virtue of the university that you teach at and the fact that you're here on the webinar today, that this is something that you also care about. So today's session then is all about really developing your expertise as an educator, not by telling you to change what you're doing, but instead challenging you to examine what you're doing and seeing what you can add to that. Because developing expertise actually requires an ongoing effort to purposefully develop expertise. Simply gaining more and more and more experience doesn't lead to the same level of return on investment in terms of getting better and better and better at something. When we have no experience and we first start to learn it, that increase in experience tends to lead to a positive outcome in terms of how well we're doing. But after a certain period of time, once we've got to a point where we feel that we know what we're doing, a very typical human response in any situation is to then sort of take your foot off the pedal in terms of really trying to improve your capability. And so what we're doing here today is the opposite of that, focusing on small aspects of your skill set and seeing how we can improve those to really develop your expertise. And when I say that expertise must be purposefully developed, it perhaps won't be news to you that research in this area, and the research team, Anders Ericsson, who's a North American professor, and his research team, who together have done a lot of work in terms of what it takes to really develop expertise, oftentimes, time and time again, have found that expertise doesn't, as I said, grow linearly with experience, and particularly when that's not what we're focused on. So one of the key conclusions from a variety of research that they've published is that the long-term education of a professor and the long-term professional expertise of a professor has really a minimal effect on producing a positive outcome for the students in terms of student capability building, that those things don't necessarily translate into excellence in teaching. And so it takes a purposeful effort against looking at how we can improve our teaching in order for us to keep developing our expertise and indeed improve. Now, the model that I use, both in my own approach to teaching, but in my own approach to my own expertise, but also when I'm working with students to develop their skills, is a model called deliberate practice. And it's a model that works like this. When we look at any activity, whether it's teaching or analyzing data or leading a team, these are easy things to name, but actually they're very complex skills that involve a lot of different practices, techniques, and capabilities. The concept or the model of deliberate practice involves breaking the complex skill into component pieces, identifying areas of and components in which you can find room to improve, and then deliberately working at improving those individual pieces where you have the most room to improve as a method to developing your expertise. And so my approach today with you, I know that, as I say, many of you care a great deal about being great educators. I'm sure you have a lot of fantastic practices already. My goal is simply to see what can we add to that toolkit so that you can just take it up another level, another 5, 10, 15, 20% on top of what you're already doing. My goal for you today then is to develop some key insights from the behavioral science principles I'll be sharing with you, and on the basis of those insights to actually commit to some action steps. So what we're looking at is, and if you don't have one already with you, it's a great idea. I always have a pen and a piece of paper next to me whenever I'm engaging in any kind of learning exercise. If you do have a pen and a piece of paper somewhere nearby, actually writing down your insights in your own words helps to push them further into your own thinking and cause you to come up with more processed, more developed insights. So I'm going to challenge you throughout this session. I'm about to move into the behavioral science principles, to write down the things that occur to you, to see if you can develop at minimum 3 to 5 personal takeaways or insights in your own words, things that matter to you. And on top of that, to identify at least 2 to 3 action steps, things that you believe you can try that will work for you based on the kind of teaching that you do and the kind of approach that you like to take. And then finally, what I'm going to ask you to do is plan to take at least one of those action steps in the next 48 hours. So in summary, this is, if we were physically together in a room, I would actually be handing you out a sheet and asking you to write on it, a sheet that looks like this, where I'm asking you to physically write down up to 5, perhaps even more, personal takeaways in your own words, up to 3 action steps that you can take to apply the things you've learned in your daily activities. And then finally, I would ask you to underline or circle one of these things that you can actually commit to doing in the next 48 hours. Because if you commit to taking a small action soon, you dramatically improve the likelihood that you will do anything as a result of this session. If you instead decide, oh, I'm going to take all of these action steps, but I'll do it next week, next month, or next year, the likelihood that you end up doing anything is actually very low. So better to find something small that you can do soon to get you on the path of putting this into action than kind of delaying it for a very long time. And as Donna has mentioned, all throughout this, if you have questions, please write them down or you can type them into the chat box. I'm not going to answer them during the session itself, but I have set aside time at the end to make sure that we address your questions. And just in case, for whatever circumstance, I don't get to your specific question, I'll also be sharing contact details so that you can email them directly to me. So it is my personal commitment that I want all of your questions to be answered. Okay, so I'm going to share with you now 6 principles from behavioral science that will give you an insight into the interaction between emotion, memory, and learning. And throughout the session, again, I challenge you to write down insights that matter to you. The first overall principle that we'll start from is that your emotion significantly affects your attention and therefore your cognition. What stimuli in your environment you're paying attention to and what stimuli you code into your memory. Now, I want you to think of, let me put this a different way. When we think about memory, we tend to think that there are certain true key facts that are happening around us and that anybody who is present sees things exactly the same way as us. And we remember these things as pure reality. And that's absolutely how memory happens, as if it's a video recording of exactly what went on. Instead, what we know about memory is that at any one time, all of us, each of us is being exposed to many hundreds of thousands of different stimuli. And our memory actually kind of works like a fairly faulty coding process, whereby each one of us is selectively attending to sort of individual or different sets of stimuli in our environment, coding them selectively and storing them in memory. And what that results in is actually, instead of a very accurate data, fact-based recall of what has been going on in the last day, in the last week, in the last month, each of us ends up with a sort of individualized and somewhat faulty picture of reality. Now, I'm just going to demonstrate a small one of these to you now and choose this experience because oftentimes I find it's one people can relate to, of how inaccurate memories are actually really commonplace, and that is driven because our emotion drives our attention, which drives our cognition of what we're coding, what we're thinking about, what we're paying attention to. So I want you to think back to the last time that you were at a large buffet spread with some friends or family. Maybe it was a Christmas meal, maybe it was a kid's birthday party or a brunch of some kind, and there was a lot of delicious food around, not particularly healthy food perhaps, and you enjoyed yourself, and later that day you were sitting on the couch and you were thinking, not feeling too well. You say, oh, my stomach hurts. I ate a burger and I ate a plate of fries and I ate a donut. And then your flatmate or your partner or your child very helpfully pipes up and says, actually, it was 3 donuts and a whole pizza. And I'm hoping that many of you can relate to that sort of experience. So what has happened there? Well, our brains were not paying attention to every little thing that we were putting in our mouths. And you would think that something that you pick up and actually put into your mouth would be exactly the kind of stimulus that you would pay optimum attention to. But yet oftentimes we don't. And in fact, studies show that on a very regular basis, we massively underestimate the kinds of foods that we take in. And that increases significantly in environments in which we're feeling strong emotions, like if we're very happy to be at a party or be with a family members or be with a group of people. And so what this forces us to recognize, and I share this model here from a book on emotions, learning, and the brain, that actually we tend to think of how we're feeling and what we're thinking about as two distinct arenas. But in actual fact, emotion has an awful lot to do with the cognitive processes that are happening in our brains, where we're paying attention, what we're coding, what we're remembering about previous events. And so too is all of, let's say, the facts and figures and knowledge and exercises that we might be sharing in a classroom. And so as a result of that, we move from the first principle, which is that emotion intertwines with cognition, with memory, to the recognition that actually your students' current emotional state, because of this overlap we see, because inside our brains we're dealing with emotional responses at the same time as dealing with the stimuli that are presented in front of us, that the students' current emotional state is actually part of their learning landscape. Now, it's tricky because this is a part of their learning landscape that you really can't see. And so when we look around your tutorial group or your Zoom call or your classroom, what you see is a group of people who ostensibly, as far as you can tell, are having the same experience. But in actual fact, they're not, because the emotional state that they are bringing with them to the classroom that continues to exist as they're in the classroom is actually affecting the sorts of processes that are going on in their brain while they're attending to the stimuli and the information that you're presenting. Now, in order to continue on to the next couple of behavioral science principles that I wanted to share with you, I wanted to cover it's not really an anecdote, it's the outline of an experiment in which we learned a number of things about emotion and attention and memory that we weren't aware of having been shared in the literature previously. So I'm going back now to 2017, and we were working with a group of Masters in International Business students. These are students who typically are in their early to mid-20s, the age range usually about 21 to 29. And this small experiment that we ran was originally intended to look at the effects of teaching style on students' response in class. So we set out to understand if a change in teaching style halfway through a master's degree class would affect students' mood, learning, and recall. And this work was done by three of us, Professor Nick Wake, who's a professor of operations management. He teaches at Warwick in the UK and also at Hult, one of our MBA graduates from the previous year, and myself. The paper was presented at a conference in Scotland, and very recently it occurred to me how relevant it is, and hence I wrote up this practitioner article for Training Zone. So this is what we were attempting to do, understand if a change in teaching style would change the way students responded to a subject. In terms of methodology, this is what we set up. So our classes at Hult are around 3 hours long with a break in the middle. And over the course of this particular class, Nick wanted to cover 2 concepts from operations management. So he dedicated 90 minutes to each of these 2 subjects. So if we look over here, we've got subject 1, which lasted for 90 minutes, and subject 2 lasting for 90 minutes. Now, the group of master students were randomly assigned to, the class were randomly assigned to different groups using a random number generator. And group A experienced subject 1 in being taught through a high energy style, then subject 2 being taught using a low energy style. Now, let me explain those energy styles. The high energy style class involved a large and very lively simulation. So they were simulating actually a supply chain, and there was a lot of activity, a lot of folding up of colored paper and passing on bits and pieces of material. And when Nick was teaching this, he was teaching this with quite a lot of humor and engagement with the students. The low energy teaching style, which he swapped to after the break and used to teach subject 2 to group A, involves simply showing material on the board, a couple of references to the fact that they really needed to pay attention because this was a really difficult topic and it was so important that they really paid attention, and avoiding making eye contact. So group A experienced subject 1 using the high energy style teaching method, a short break, and then subject 2 in the low energy teaching style method. And group B, randomly assigned to students to a different group, had the reverse situation where subject 1 was taught using the low energy style, and then subject 2 using the high energy style. And the measurements that we took were the following. Firstly, we asked the students to complete a number of questions at the end of each subject. And one of those questions involved rating their mood at that moment. And then what we did 2 days later, the students were given a spontaneous test of both subjects. They didn't know it was coming, so there was no particular opportunity to prepare that would have been different between the two groups. And of course, it didn't count in their assessment, so it was a fair thing to do. It was literally just a spontaneous test of what they had learned on each of these subjects 2 days previous. Now, in terms of findings, as you can imagine, based off the literature around when people are happy, they tend to pay more attention. What we expected to find was the following, that the high energy teaching style would result in students feeling a happier mood, and that they would learn better because they would be paying more attention when they were engaged. We therefore expected that Group A would achieve better results on Subject 1 and Group B better results on Subject 2. That is, we expected to find that Group A would feel happier during Subject 1 and would do better on the test for Subject 1, and that Group B would feel happier during Subject 2 and would do better on the test for Subject 2. But we were wrong about that. So what we found was the following. Group A started out in a positive mood, and they actually stayed positive. There was no statistically significant change in their mood between mood 1 and mood 2 at the end of the second subject. In contrast, Group B started off feeling pretty meh, and despite the break and the change in teaching style now to the high energy simulation with the humor, etc., there was no significant change in their mood. There was, however, a highly significant difference between the mood of the two groups. Secondly, therefore we found that the change in teaching style did not affect the mood once it had been established. What we also found was that Group A scored significantly higher when they were tested on both of the subjects. The change in teaching style from low to high energy approach at this halfway point did not improve either the mood or the learning in Group B. So just to put that back into graphical format as per the methodology, this is what we found. Group A undertook subject 1 with this high energy style, and at the end of that, they were feeling positive. They then had a break. They undertook subject 2 in the low energy style, and at the end of that, they were feeling positive. And the test 2 days later, they scored quite well on both of the subjects. And when I say quite well, at around about a sort of B average level. Group B, on the other hand, started off at a pretty neutral mood, and that was at the end of subject 1 after they'd done subject 1 experiencing it with the low energy teaching style. They then had a break. They experienced the high energy teaching style with a simulation. Their mood didn't change. And 2 days later, their performance on both subjects was kind of hovering around a pass. So this led us to the conclusion that emotion actually does not need to be highly positive or negative to affect learning and memory. So what we're used to, and what you might have been aware of previously, if you've known anything about emotion and learning, is that of course people are more likely to remember or to pay attention to events that are highly emotive for them. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates this. If somebody has experienced a very positive event last week, such as winning an award, or a very negative event in the previous week, like their manager coming 30 minutes late to their own presentation, of course, they are more likely to remember those events than their colleagues for whom it was not an emotive event. But in this experiment, what we found is if this were a rating scale, the emotions that were that were being produced from the activity and which appear to have been affecting the learning were not at all at the extreme ends of the scale, but actually this was about where group A would sit, and this is about where group B would sit. So we're not talking about wildly happy or wildly positive, we're talking about actively positive versus meh. That's the kind of distinction that we're looking at here. So that's insight number 3. Insight number 4, which really surprised us, was that the emotional state established early in the class endured well beyond what our expectations were. And we knew that the group B was unlikely to be feeling really happy at the end of subject 1, but we did not expect that that mood would endure almost irrespective of what we then did after the break, that having been established at the start of class, it endured then for the break and the hour and a half afterwards, irrespective of what we then did. And the 5th finding, or the 5th principle, I should say, that I wanted to present to you today, is that the emotional state being created in a student can potentially be affected by what is seemingly quite innocuous stimuli. Let me explain what I mean by that. We could simply walk away from the experiment thinking that the neutral emotional state was caused by the students engaging in this low energy teaching exercise, but it's possible there was a little bit more to it than that. So both of these groups of students, as you know, because of research ethics, both of these groups of students knew that they were going to take part in an experiment. But because of the logistics of running the procedure, Group A actually coming into the classroom, knowing that they're going to start in an experiment, but are immediately engaged in something positive. But they also started class at the regular time. Group B, because of the logistics in resetting the simulation, actually had to start class half an hour later than their normal time. And one of our potential hypotheses arising from this is, could it be that there was a confounding effect of that little bit of, I'm curious here, I'm going to be part of an experiment, together with the fact that they started class a bit later? Did that help, in addition to the kind of low energy teaching style, to cause them to form a more neutral, less positive mood at the beginning of class? Now, it might seem that something as small as starting class a little bit later, or coming into the classroom, meeting a professor who's doing a good job, but not in terms of presenting information, but not showing any emotion, wouldn't really have that much of an effect on students, particularly if you've got really interesting material to cover, right? So what I'd like to do now is also take you through another piece of research which shows something very similar. Now, this research was not done by me. This is Dr. Samuel Marcoura, who is actually a professor of exercise and sport sciences at the University of Kent. And his research is on endurance athletes, the psychology of fatigue and endurance, and what does it actually take for people to keep going in long-term endurance events. So one of the questions that he asks in his research, because he studies people who do like long-term multi-hour endurance events, people who do, racing orientation courses for days on end, people who do Ironman, who do many, many hours. And what he's trying to ascertain is what are the psychological aspects of enabling people to keep going beyond the physiological aspects of running out of energy or feeling damage. What is it that actually causes people to keep enduring versus give up? And he's published a lot of research. One of the most accessible and easy to read popular versions is this article on endurance fatigue. And what written by somebody who interviewed him, but what he explains in this and a number of his papers is his research has shown that what the difference between somebody saying, okay, that's enough, I can't possibly take another step, I can't go any further than what I'm doing right now, and somebody who actually keeps going a little bit further has a lot to do with your brain. So he will take endurance athletes and he'll have them exercising on a treadmill, on a stationary bike, on this sort of thing, and look at what point they will stop exercising and what can he do to manipulate that. And what he has found is that many a time when people, even highly trained and very fit endurance athletes, say, I can't possibly take another step, they stop. It's called what he calls time to exhaustion. That in actual fact, it isn't because of a physiological response so much as a psychological response. So he can show through muscle biopsy that there was enough energy and oxygen for the person to keep working, or through getting them involved in another task, that they actually still can continue to endure. It's their brain that intervenes, that says, you can't endure. Now, in this series of experiments I'm talking about, what Makura did was he had a group of highly trained, very fit athletes cycling to exhaustion in a studio, and they had a screen in front of them that looked like this. Now, they were asked at various periods to look at the screen, and in particular to pay attention to the cross that's in the middle of the screen. Now, as always, there were 3 different groups. There were people who were exposed to 2 different stimuli, and of course, people who didn't see anything in particular. But what he found is that some of the images that he showed at a subliminal level actually led to people increasing their time to exhaustion. And that image was actually of a person smiling. So one group of cyclists saw no image, one group of cyclists saw a person frowning, and one group of cyclists saw a person smiling at a subliminal level. So they weren't actually aware of the image that they had been shown. But those who were shown at a subliminal level, very, very fast response rate, it's flashed in front of their eyes. Somebody smiling had a significantly higher time to exhaustion than either of the other 2 groups. Now, I recount this experiment in class because what I'm doing is I'm telling my students to think about the expressions that are on their faces, that your facial expressions can affect not only the mood of your team, but the actual ability of those people to keep going when it's tough, whether you realize it and whether they realize it or not, that these expressions that you're portraying can actually have an effect on somebody's ability to endure. And so when I ask myself, can seemingly innocuous stimuli affect our emotional state, even at a level that we're not aware of? The answer that I find in many examples of literature is yes, it can. So this is just yet another principle from behavioral science to kind of stimulate your thinking. Why? Because of our emotional states when we're teaching and we want to do a good job, we think about the material we're going to prepare. We think about how can we do this in a way that will be interesting, that will attract people's attention, that explains really clearly, that breaks it down and presents the information in a logical order. But we don't tend, because of where our attention is going, to think about explicitly or implicitly acting on the emotion of the people in the room, about directing any of our management attention to that. And that in itself, the emotional state that they bring, can have a big effect on the learning landscape of the students that we're working with. Finally, and this is based off some other research, what we know is that when people are in a positive mood, they find it easier to remember other instances where they've been in a positive mood. Conversely, when people are in a negative mood, they find it easier to remember other incidents where they've been in a negative mood. So, for example, when you're having a fight with your significant other and you remember something that they did wrong and that's what you're angry about, that's a really good time to remember all the other stuff they did wrong as well, right? But what we know from research is that when people are in a positive mood, it's easier for them to remember and recall having been in a positive mood before. So when you're doing something like engaging in an activity of reading that bedtime story every night at the same time to your son or daughter, it's not just the positive effect that you're having then. By virtue of the fact that there is a regular positive effect, you are bringing into the room and making use of the positive experience that they had last time and last time and last time. And so by creating a habit of doing this, you're not only enabling that child to benefit from the positive experience they're having then, but the previous positive experiences that they've had of you doing the same thing. What that means is that if you can find practices to introduce into your teaching that sets up that positive mood at the beginning of the class, the more often you do it, the more often your students will be benefiting from it, associating that beginning of the class with that positive feeling, and more likely to recall the positive things that happened last time and in the last class and in the last class. So you're getting a significant return on investment and benefit for the effort you invest beyond just what you're doing on that one occasion. In summary, these are the behavioral science principles that we've looked at. First of all, and we looked at this with regard to your memory of what you've just eaten for lunch, that emotion significantly affects our attention and our cognition, what information or stimuli around us we're paying attention to, and which one of them we select to code into our memories. As a result of this, we need to take into account that students' current emotional state is part of their teaching and learning landscape, even though we can't see it. And that when we look at a group of students and believe that they're having the same experience, that in fact they're not. They're bringing with them, they are creating an emotional state, and that is part of what is affecting their teaching and learning. Thirdly, emotion doesn't have to be highly positive or negative to affect learning and memory. As it turns out, we saw that even nudging your students into a positive, not even a delighted or happy mood, but an actively positive mood, had a positive effect on their learning, whereas students who were nudged into being very neutral, we saw a negative effect on their learning. Fourthly, that the emotional state established early in class endured way beyond our expectations. And this is, in particular, when I think about putting this into practice, I'm very mindful of the beginning of class. Fifthly, that the emotional state and therefore the student's ability to learn may be affected by seemingly quite innocuous stimuli, that things that we do that may not seem relevant to us because we're busy thinking about the exercises we're going to run and the information we're going to present, that innocuous stimuli like asking people to start later, like beginning your class in a low energy style, like perhaps talking about any kind of negative things or problems or worries or concerns right at the beginning of class could nudge people into a mood that could potentially endure for a much longer period of time, even if you then ramp it up and become more high energy later on. And sixth, that a positive mood makes it easier for people to remember recent positive events. So every time that you're engaging in this sort of practice at the beginning of the class, you're potentially benefiting from every previous time that you've done that. And so that's our session on the behavioral science principles. In terms of principles, how can you then put these into action and to go on to influence emotion in your classroom? Now, I'm not going to tell you what I think you should do. My goal is to help you understand some principles that you can use to apply and create your own kinds of practices. So when I think about building people's skills, one of the things I do is use the analogy of driving. When an instructor teaches you to drive, you learn how to move the car. You learn how to go forward, how to turn corners safely, how to reverse, how to overtake. You take these underlying principles and then you adapt them to your own situation, whether you're changing lanes or driving on a motorway or avoiding all of the bicycles on the road or whatever you have to be doing at that particular time. So what I want to do now is talk about how I applied this in my own thinking and my own approach. But I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting you should have to do the same, and nor do I want to tell you specifically what you should do. You should at this point, you'll likely at this point find that thinking about exactly how to capitalize on these principles could be kind of hard, because if you're not used to spending time and attention thinking about what you could do to influence people's emotion, then whenever we try to do something new, it does initially seem hard, right? So what I want to do now is just add some stimuli to all of this that might inspire you to start thinking about adaptations, additions, things that would work for you in your circumstances with the classes and the students that you teach. So here are some of the considerations that after thinking through these specific principles, things I started to take into account preparing for teaching this year. And when I started teaching this year, like you, I had a very unusual situation versus what I was used to in the past. But in my classes, I can have maybe 75 people, let's say 25 of whom are in the room. This is what happened to me in October, November, December. They're 2 meters apart. They're wearing masks. I have another classroom of 25 people 2 meters apart wearing masks, but they're in another classroom because we can't fit them all together in one place socially distanced, and they're logged in via Zoom to my classroom. And then I have 25 people online from sort of Japan to Brazil. So I'm highly cognizant of the fact that the emotional landscapes that these people are sitting in are very different from the one that I'm experiencing. So I started to plan for this, and these are some of the considerations that I put to myself. The first was, okay, if your students rated their mood on a 7-point scale, 30 minutes into your class, what would you have to do in those 30 minutes to ensure that when they gave their answer, they were actively positive? This is how I started working backwards from the research to try to work out what I should do. What would it take to make sure they were actively positive, knowing that that can have a very beneficial outcome on their mood and on their learning, and ultimately probably on my teacher evaluation score, right? My second question was, am I going to do this as a conscious, explicit practice that I discuss with them, or am I going to do it in a more implicit way so that I am attempting to influence and manage their emotional landscape without actually telling them, which I have to say, as a psychologist and behavioral scientist, they always expect of me to some extent anyway. I'm constantly telling them, no, you're not in an experiment. If you were, I would have to inform you of it, right? But that was a question I had to ask myself. Do I want to do this consciously and talk about it or not? Or do I want to do a mixture of them? I started thinking about how can I establish routines that start class so that I remember and pay attention to starting in an actively positive manner each time. And a fourth question I asked myself is, how can I explain, we often start class by talking about what we're going to do in a very factual way, because when we're preparing material, we think about factually, this is what we're going to cover, and we think about being logical and laying out for everybody so they can understand. But there was some research I read recently. I was looking for the reference for you, and I can't find it at this moment, but if you want it, you can email me and I'll find you the reference, that was looking at what are the factors that explain why a YouTube video goes viral. And one of the things that neuroscience has uncovered is that people are most likely to share and videos that in the very beginning of the video promises them some kind of reward. So the reward activates, or the content of the video activates the reward center in their brain. So if, irrespective of their verbal or conscious feedback on a video, what neuroscientists have found is that if the reward center of their brain lights up, showing that they are anticipating something, they're going to get a reward, something positive is going to happen, they're going to learn how to knock everybody dead at a party or act confident, etc., that they are more likely to share. And so this is another question I was asking myself: how can I start that part where you talk about what you're going to cover, and instead of being factual and logical, how can I set it up in a way that would activate the reward centers in their brain? So to talk about what I'm going to do in terms of what benefit it's going to bring them, how it's going to help them in their career, or help them stand out in the workplace, or help them do a better job in their classes or in their internship, etc. So these are the sorts of questions I was asking myself. What would I have to do in the first 30 minutes to make sure my students are actively positive, not just okay, and not just paying attention, actively positive, right? They're different things. If you aim for different things, you'll achieve different things. Do I prefer for this to be conscious, implicit, or explicit, or both? What can I do to establish a routine so it keeps happening at the beginning of class, because then I'll get maximal benefit from it in terms of creating a positive landscape for my students? And how can I explain my overview of what's going to happen in a class in a way that really sets off that reward center in their brain so that they're engaged and paying attention? What I plan to do, and this is just very recently, I taught data, the course I was talking about with the 25 students was data analysis. It's typically a course that people are fairly nervous about upfront. And what I planned to do was use a combination of explicit and implicit approaches, and to be very mindful of them in the first 30 minutes of class. I think it's hard to keep your attention on both managing emotion and managing information throughout the whole class. But I just chose to focus really on the first 30 minutes. I thought if I can push them into being positive in those 30 minutes, then hopefully that mood will endure. So my first aim, as I said, start off the class talking about what we're going to do this class in a way that I believe will have the best chance of activating that reward system in their brain so that they can anticipate something good's going to come from this. Secondly, an explicit competition that I launched, and I'm going to show you details of that in a moment. What I chose to do was actually launch a competition across all of the cohorts of students, asking them to identify an image that would have the highest likelihood of causing the other people in the room to smile. And they would send their business appropriate images to me. I would curate them. And if I presented your image at the beginning of class, you were in the running for a prize. And I'll explain the details and show you some examples of that in a moment. Another implicit thing I did is to be very mindful of the images I'm showing, again, particularly at the beginning of class. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. And then fourthly, it's a bit of a sneaky one, right? When we treated the students in a high energy, very positive way, and then later after the break, taught in a very boring way, reminding them of like how horrible and difficult the subject was going to be, that didn't have a negative effect on them once it was later, once the positive mood had been established. So I was also very mindful that if I had anything to talk about that might potentially induce anxiety or be perceived as negative, I didn't talk about that until after the break. So I spent the first 30 minutes being very focused on, okay, imagine at the end of the 30 minutes, they're going to fill in this survey and they're going to be, I want them to be actively positive. They didn't do it. I wasn't able to take, it's hard enough doing the teaching this particular year versus actually taking the measurements. But what would it take for them to tick that they were actively positive? And as I say, anything that might put a hole or a dent in that, I kept it until after the break, once the positive mood had been established. So when I talk about images, I just discussed with you Samuel Makura's experiment, in which subliminally flashed images of a person smiling that cyclists were not even aware they had seen, had a statistically significant effect on increasing their time to exhaustion versus groups who were matched in terms of training and fitness who didn't see those images. Now, I show a lot of images of people in my slides, and particularly images of people smiling. I've also chosen a range of other images that I will find a reason to have on the screen and to talk about, to show to people, and perhaps just casually have these images up there for a good reason, but while I'm speaking about other things. Subliminally, injecting, I hope, calm and a feeling of positivity. And I want to remind you that my students are not seeing anybody smile, right? So we're all masked. And what we know about this is that it's cutting out the vast majority of positive expressions that anybody might see. So no one in the classroom is seeing anybody smile. And what's more, by not seeing anybody smile, they're much less likely to smile themselves. And so these sorts of pictures of people smiling are really important because it's the only smiling they're going to see in my classroom. But then what I did, as I said, I launched this competition. I actually explained to the students the experiment and told them about this article that explained the experiment. And then I said, okay, here's a competition for you. Your goal is to find an image, a business appropriate entry. It can be a drawing, it can be, excuse me a second. It can be a drawing, it can be a picture, a meme, and your goal is that when I put it up on the screen, everybody in the room is going to smile behind their masks, but they're going to smile. I just tried it out in the first class or two, and I wasn't sure how it would go. I have to say, I was absolutely surprised by the response that I got. People who honestly hadn't ever shown necessarily that much interest in doing the assignments were now suddenly interested in taking part in this competition. So what I would do at the beginning of class is start with an overview where I'm talking about the reward, what they're going to gain, what's going to benefit them from this class, what they can expect to gain. And then I would launch into, and that was, as I say, an implicit way, an unconscious way of influencing how they were feeling. And then I would launch into the competition, which was the routine part, where I would say, but before we do that, how are we all feeling today? And I was able to continue to do this because I'd explained to them why I was doing it. So I had a scientific reason for continuing to show them this, the competition. But as I reminded them we were about to go into the competition, of course, I would have this picture up on the screen and I'd say, look into the faces. These are your classmates who aren't wearing masks. Can you see anybody there who potentially looks like you? I'd find reasons to have them looking into these pictures. It only takes a minute, 2 minutes. And then what I did is shared with the class the picture, the profile of each of the people who had made an entry. and share with the class, just over a couple of minutes, what are some of these memes and images that they had contributed as part of a competition to see if they could make their classmates smile. So this one was actually one of my favorites for the Data and Decisions class from Samin, who is a UAE national. And then we had Anis from Tunisia, sending in a positive image that he felt would make everybody smile. And then David from the UK contributed this one, which actually got an audible laugh out of people around the room. And then this is just a selection. As I say, I was quite surprised. I had 3 or 4 memes or images sent in for every class that I was going to run. And then Alessia from Russia shared this skipping class in February looked like this, and skipping class in March looked like this. And in this way, they were very simply and without taking up a lot of time, expressing and getting involved in creating this positive mood. I'm not suggesting that you should do exactly the things that I've done by any stretch of the imagination. In addition, I've just put these things into practice, and I haven't experimentally measured how the students specifically responded to those things or whether or not it improved their learning. What I do know is that, as I said, we're very cautious, very invested in the evaluations that we get from students. We get a 5-page report in which they've rated us on a whole variety of different things, and they write their spontaneous comments, their input, and that in a 30-hour contact hour course on data analysis, which many people went into feeling very nervous and anxious, the competition actually got a few spontaneous comments in my evaluation, and they rated my course at 94%, which really shocked me, given that it was such a course with a lot of anxious people beforehand, and I felt that the teaching opportunities were significantly affected by the environments we were all in. Now, I can't promise you that the practices I did had a significant effect on that outcome, but I personally had a very good outcome, and I will continue to invest time in planning what I'm going to do at the beginning of classes to set people up in a positive mood. So what I'd like you to do now is think in terms of what you can take away from these insights, what you will do in your classes. And I'm going to come back to this recording that I would encourage you to do your personal takeaways. And I'm going to actually pause in the presentation to give you time to write down some personal takeaways, to write down some action steps, and then think in terms of what action step you will commit to within 48 hours. And in order to do that, and to encourage you to actually, with me, let me check I've got this at the right level, take some moment to reflect and to write something down. Can you hear that, Donna? So what I'm doing now is putting on some reflective music to help encourage you while I time 2 minutes, during which I hope you will take the time to write down some takeaways and record some action steps. So I'm going to stop speaking now and give you 2 minutes to actively, physically write some takeaways and some potential action steps for yourself. Okay, so if I've done that properly, that should be 2 minutes. And Donna, can I get a thumbs up? You can still see my screen. It says personal takeaways, action steps. Okay, so that's the end of the material that I wanted to share with you. But what I wanted to do now was to invite you to people who are brave to share with us one personal insight, one personal takeaway, and potentially one action step, just as an example of something that you've taken away from the presentation and something that you would consider doing. Can I ask for some volunteers for that? Is there someone there who's willing to share with us? Don't be shy. If you've got a good idea, share that with people.
And just to reiterate, so you can post your comments in the chat, and we're picking those up right now. Otherwise, I'm also happy to give you video and audio rights, and you can join in with us a little bit.
But if you have personal insight takeaways or personal action steps and you're willing to share them, that can also, Carolina, will just start with insights if I can, and I'll move to questions in a moment. I have set aside the last 10 minutes for questions, and I will answer them. But if you have any ideas, any insights, any takeaways, if I ask you what is the thing that you've learned or that matters to you, if you're willing to share that with the group of people online, that can help other people stimulate their own thinking and their own takeaways and plans for action also. So it would be terrific if you have anything there that you've written down. I can't see your name, so I can't cold call you. But if you would be willing to share something, it can help all of the other people who are listening also.
While everyone's thinking about it, I can share like my thoughts if you like. So I mean, it's something that I've learned before is the ARCS model of instructional design, and the A stands for attention. So they always say that the first thing that you need to do is get the attention from the students. But I think this goes a step forward, and at the beginning it's not just, like you said, not just about getting attention, but about setting the mood. And I was thinking, oh, how do you do that? And you gave some nice examples. You know, it doesn't have to be an educational activity. It can just be a fun game or a fun icebreaker or a little story or an anecdote where you set the scene. But about the reward centers, I guess like novelty is a really important part of that. So you can't keep doing the same thing at the start of every class. So it becomes more of a challenge, I guess. And also relating to how you said about being explicit or implicit. And I wonder whether, and this is more of a question, but it was what I was thinking about, whether I could give the role to the students. When I was a student at school, somebody told me about a piece of research that if you were happy, you were more likely to do well in an exam. So religiously, before every exam I took at high school, I would watch an episode of Fawlty Towers before I went to my exam. And I wondered, you know, is this something that I could tell my students and they would set themselves up for your class, so it doesn't become just your responsibility but shared responsibility. Although it did make me think another action point would be to go straight to the timetabling office and say, please don't schedule my classes after somebody who's really boring, because I don't know how long this negative mood effect lasts. But yeah,
well, that would involve you naming the people who are really boring. So, but I think you brought up a really important point there, Donna, with regard to novelty. Now, let me be clear. It's a data analysis class. If I spent 30 minutes looking at memes, I would get complaints, right? So that we couldn't do that. What I was doing was using that as a small cue. We spent maybe 5 minutes on the happy images. There was a degree of novelty because everybody wanted to see who had sent things in and what had been sent in. And we certainly saw this snowball effect of once more and more, particularly say in the MBA cohort, people had sent something in, then more people felt pressure to also participate. So people wanted to see what was coming up, but it just set that standard. And it also enabled me to think in terms of, so I'm going to start the class talking about how this is going to really help them. And I'll do that for a few minutes with some positive images on the screen. And I'm pretty good at talking, so I'd often do that for sort of 5, 6, 7 minutes, but making it very relevant to the class. And then I'd say, well, before we do that though, and we would engage in the meme, and then I would be, as I say, really have my brain switched on to be very mindful of the mood I was creating, at least for the first 30 minutes. After that, it's pretty hard explaining the normal distribution and the central limit theorem and stuff, but at the same time, just to be mindful of that. And I think you're right, Donna, there's a lot that we see that teaches us to try to get people's attention at the beginning of the class. But if that is your goal, then you might be tempted to get people's attention by saying, okay, now we're going to talk about how scary the exam is. And I think as an outcome of this session, we would do not do that, right? If you've got bad news, wait till after the break. That's definitely something I would recommend. I have got a lot of really interesting insights here.
Can I just remind, some people are sharing in the chat, but you also have the option, if you look at the little arrow in the top of the chat, you can either share to the panelists or to all attendees as well. So some people have sent them just to us. Did you want to go through some of those, Amanda?
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is, I'm so sorry, I don't know if I can pronounce that. There's somebody who's written, their name is G. Krag. Is G. Krag still with us? If you are, is he or she able to unmute themselves? Or would you unmute?
I think I can unmute them if they don't mind that.
If that's okay, you could unmute G. Krag, Bo Nui.
Okay, hello, now you can hear me?
Hi there.
Yes, it's a difficult name, I know. It's Gerda Kaag. Well, I noticed that I routinely start my lessons and classes with students. So one of my takeaways was to be more aware of how I start those classes and not go from one teaching obligation to another one. Really try to think on how I will start to induce a positive mood in my students.
Gerda, could I suggest that that over, and you guys won't be going to lunch yet, I guess, but maybe at your lunchtime today, if you could think in terms of one thing you can do to start that process. So what we know is, let's say you're not teaching for a day or two or next month and you think, oh, I'll do it later. If you can find one small action step you can take now, as soon as possible, either for your next class if you're teaching soon, or to prepare something for your next class if the class isn't for a week, but actually start the preparation now. If you could do something, and the sooner the better, you're more likely to be able to benefit from that insight.
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
So welcome. And Bo Nui, is that correct? Would you like to share your insight with us?
Hello, this is Bo. Nice to meet you.
Hi.
I'm not a teacher, but I'm a study advisor. Mm-hmm. And I found it really interesting, your presentation. So thank you for sharing. What I had a few insights, but one of them was that facial expressions have a positive effect on the endurance of students. Yeah. So I think that was like, really amazing to hear. And I think it's not only for teachers, but also for study advisor or career advisor and counselor. It's really important that if you have a one-on-one meeting with the student, that you take into account what effect you have on the student that you talk to.
And without actively putting attention against it. I mean, when I teach the executive MBAs and I talk to them about, you're with your team, it's late in the evening, everybody's getting tired, you're annoyed, what's showing on your face? And imagine if what's showing on your face isn't just upsetting or your team, it's actively reducing their ability to keep going. Like, it's not just that they don't feel good, right? And it's not about you going home and thinking, oh, you know, I upset my workers, so what? You're actively reducing their ability to continue. And yeah, so thank you. That's a lovely insight. I appreciate it. Oscar.
Can I just add the power of a smile is so important, so influential. I'm a qualified watchmaker, and if next time you're flipping through a magazine and you see an advert for a watch or a clock, look at what time it is. Adverts for watches and clocks, it's always 10 past 10, and the reason why is because 10 past 10 looks like a smile, and they think that influences sales because people feel happier when they look at them. So
well, again, this you know, the work by Makura, I used to be able to get online the little video of what was shown to the cyclists, and it's insane that this had an effect on them. And if you'd interviewed them, not one of them would have known that it had an effect on them. Oscar, did you want to share with us what you're planning to do? Hi, Oscar.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks, Amanda, for your talk. It was really interesting. And it made me think of sort of the small nuances between at the beginning of a new course or project, as I'm about to sort of start later this week, asking, why are you here? Which I often do, is to sort of bring in sort of the emotive aspect a little more. I think you have to be careful not to overdo that, but to really say things along the lines of, why are you excited to be here? And in this particular project, that is actually quite relevant because it is a competitive project to get into for students, and they really sort of can be expected to be excited to start. So to sort of, before all the necessary sort of explanations are given by me, I think, yeah, it's that simple thing. Asking them, why are you excited to be here? Rather than just, okay, what brought you to this project?
That's great. And having each person say, for example, what could be the best possible outcome this could have for your career? And having people really envisage and get into that. And you said, you know, it's important to be careful, Oscar. You know, you can't see it on the camera, but I'm a 155 centimeter female teaching a data analysis course to a bunch of 22, 23-year-old predominant males. And, you know, I'm very aware of the potential implicit bias that they will have about my teaching. And so I'm not going to come into the classroom and start talking, you know, unicorns and this sort of, I'm very careful. I have to be very data-based. I don't want to start my class sounding like I'm here as the happiness fairy. I'm saying that to you jokingly because, yeah, it is important. First of all, it's really important that the practices you take are ones that you're comfortable with, because otherwise you won't do anything. I've been very explicit in talking to you about the things I do. I'm quite careful when I'm in class. I was very careful. I didn't want any spontaneous comments in my course evaluation saying, you know, what are we doing looking at cartoons for 20 minutes? I'm paying X $1,000 for this, right? That I was very careful about. So that's why I chose this mix of implicit and explicit, where the competition was short, but it kept me focused on making sure I was being very positive to begin with. But I think that's an excellent idea. Why are you?
And just real quick, I assume that sort of it is as important that your own excitement is genuine as well. So that's where it starts, I guess.
But I don't think that the professors at Maastricht would be on this call without them being concerned to be excited about being
all the time.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Christine? Oh, just 5 minutes to go. Okay, one more. Let's say Christine. Sorry, I'm just taking these in order, and then I'll take Carolina's question. Christine, did you want to share with us your idea?
Yes, I will. First of all, thank you for your insights. I'll be very quick about it. I've had this idea for a couple of years, and now it comes to my mind it would be more effective to get students being focused at the beginning of a class, making them mindful of their state and injecting them with positivity. And with my pearls of wisdom that I've gained throughout my experience in my profession as an OBGYN specialist. So that's the thing that they won't learn from the books, but I can give them by true experience, and giving them the reward at the beginning of that session, so they will be rewarded afterwards. So I thought that mindfulness and getting them into the right state of mind, would that be helpful?
As I say, whatever's comfortable for you, but I think what's so important in what you've said is the acknowledgement that they're coming into the room with different emotional states. And, we just can't avoid that. We've got students from all over the world. I've had students sitting next to each other in class where one girl's dealing with the fact that her uncle subpoenaed her to court to try to take custody of her baby brother, and some other kid whose biggest problem is his girlfriend didn't text him back, right? And that they're in completely different emotional states, but finding some way that works for you of attempting to bring them to the right emotional state, and not just in terms of attention, so that whatever else has been going on is now closed off. And, I'd encourage you to experiment with different ways of doing that, to see what you feel gives you the best results in bringing people so that they're all in the one place emotionally and mentally, and feeling, but remember, actively feeling positive, not just paying attention. But yeah, that sounds really, great place to start.
Thank you.
Now, Donna's reminded me we don't have very much time left. I know Carolina asked if she could ask a question. Let me quickly cover. Somebody has asked me if they can get the references. I'm happy to put together a reference list and share that with Donna to go out to people. Sure. And Carolina, you asked if you could ask a question. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for your talk. It was really fascinating. I'm a lawyer, so as a lawyer, as I said actually before, we tend to focus overly on content. But I actually have two questions. One is about nitty-gritty of the competition. The other one is actually about our experience here at Maastricht University, and I'll come to it in a moment. So let's first the nitty-gritty because it's easier.
Okay.
When do you exactly announce this competition? Is it at the very beginning of the course, or is it that they send in the images to you whilst you kind of open up the class and saying, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. Don't forget to send an image just now. Or is it that they do it before you actually
No, so this was before, and the course was, and as I say, it was one they're particularly nervous about. I gave them a survey beforehand and asked them to indicate their anxiety about the course on a scale of 0 to 100, and I got an average of like 60, and many people giving 98 and 90, and I knew they were really anxious. So I said, well, we're going to make database decisions, and I started with explaining the experiment to them and say, so we're going to do this, and this is why. So they had the science-based justification. And then what I asked them to do was to send in their entries whenever they could, and then I would review them, and I would choose 2, 3, 4 to add to my slides at the beginning of the class. And what happened is, as I started showing these, and particularly the MBAs are quite a cohesive group, as they saw other people doing it, more and more they started joining in. And then actually, just as I'm speaking to you now, I realized there was meant to be a prize at the end. What happened to that? I think by the time we got to the end of the course, I forgot to award one. But as I said, I was surprised to see spontaneous comments about it in the evaluation. So you had a second question.
The second question is really about, because what you were saying is really great to apply in the context of a lecture. So a situation where you talk a lot, and and it's really important to keep the momentum up, because otherwise you lose them at some point. But here at Maastricht University, we work with a methodology that's called problem-based learning, which means that, of course, it is theory, and in some faculties it is used to a larger extent, and others to a lesser extent. Well, in law, what we tendentially do is that we first train them in the PBL and gradually leave or give away the control over how the class goes in a tutorial setting. in a sense that in the end, it is really in fact that the discussion leader takes over the running of the course. And now the thing is that the discussion leaders are usually either super enthusiastic students that really want to show how they learn and how they actually see the topic. Sometimes, though, they are those people that really just end up there by accident and they don't really want to do this work. And then, of course, the whole class really depends on how these guys are doing, because we there are really de facto participants. We're not supposed to participate in other ways than to ask questions, so to formulate questions that obviously tune in the discussion to the topics that we want to cover. But in theory, it is up to the students to determine what are the learning outcomes for a given encounter, and how this encounter actually goes, which means that sometimes they may not reach those learning outcomes. So the question from my side is really twofold. On one hand is what would be the role then of the tutor in that context, so that the person who sets the tone at the very beginning, because what we do as tutors, we just come in, we say, okay, hi, hello, this is what we're going to talk about. Let's have a look at what we did last time. Okay, it's up to you now, discussion leader, to take over, establish the learning outcomes, or just bring in the learning outcomes from the previous session and then run the session. And so how, do you have perhaps any suggestions of how to actually very briefly and quickly tune in really the discussion leader to actually also bring in a little bit more of a positivity to the room? Because what I see is that very often, I can be like, hoo, and then the discussion leader is like, okay, so today we're supposed to...
Because they're nervous, and so they're just focused on getting their facts and figures right. So I'm going to answer your question in a way that won't be exactly what you're after, and that is, I really hesitate to tell people exactly the practices they should do, because if I tell you need to, wear red or stand a certain way, or that might not work for you. And it's not the specific practice that is proven in the science. It's the principle behind what happens when certain things occur. And that's why, as you can see on the screen here, my challenge to you is to think through, so what can you do, given that that the beginning of class can really make a difference, that a actively positive mood versus a neutral mood can really improve people's mood throughout the class and their learning. And I don't want to even give you specific, because then what you might end up doing is, if I give you a suggestion, you try it, it doesn't work, or you don't like it, and then you won't act on this. And that's where I would go back to. Let me just, sorry, I'm just trying to get rid of this. There we go. That's where I go back to, like, here are the questions I used to work out what I was going to do. The actions I took aren't proven actions per se. It's just simply, I asked myself, what could I do? I have a 3-hour class. So I have about 30 minutes. If you have, I don't know, an hour and it's student-led, what do you have? How can you ensure that I even ask sometimes the question, if my job depended on this, what would I have to do to ensure that they were actively positive? And do I want to do this in a conscious or unconscious way? How can I make them feel that there's reward coming? So these are, as I say again, sorry, I just get myself back to where we were, just to say that I don't want to prescribe practices for you. If what you would like to do, though, Carolina, is have a think about it and then perhaps over email discuss it with me, I'm very open to do that. But I want to challenge each person to think, if this is the way it works, what can you do to adapt it to your situation? And
I can say that.
I realized over time,
what we did once is that we basically made them run around, as in walk, move. That works. Surprisingly.
Look, as I say, I'm happy to discuss it on email if you would like. I just wanted to add, if anyone would like to connect with me on LinkedIn, you can ask me questions there, or perhaps Donna can share my email address. If you would like some of the references, I'm happy to share those. And I have some videos available under this Career Success Psychology name on YouTube, where you can find information about deliberate practice. There's the video there on deliberate practice as a technique for improving expertise. So I'm just mindful that I've overrun. I didn't mean to cut you off, Carolina. So if you have any further questions, you're welcome to email me. I know Donna's been trying to wind me up for a while now. So let me say, I hope you have a terrific week. And it's been really a pleasure interacting with professors at Maastricht University.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've really enjoyed it, and it really stimulated a lot of new ideas that I'm very excited to put into practice. And thank you ever so much for everyone for engaging via the chat and for posing your questions and sharing your ideas for the future, and for hanging on. I know a few of you have got to shoot off now. So thank you very much for everybody for joining us, and thank you to Amanda for presenting the session. We have recorded it, and I'll email everybody afterwards to follow up with any links and things like that. So expect an email from me later. Thank you very much, guys. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.